Okay, welcome to part 2 of the MVI 6101 and 62 agent installation and configuration training. All right, so in this section we're going to talk about the MVI NGI members. That is actually configured based on information that is put into MVCust. Okay, so we saw that the data collector was configured by information that was collected by OZCust in order to configure the MVI NGI member, and for new customers, the logger 00 member, we're going to have to go into MVCust and select our MainView infrastructure product and configure it. So we're going to talk about case 1, where we can actually share this member, and as I mentioned, the suffix that is assigned to the shared member by default is NI, so we get a member name of MVI NG any. I will also note that there are a couple of PTFs that have to be on here that we discovered in the first few customers that we actually tried this with. These are supposedly in the MSF. So as you set up your OZI and get ready to do the upgrade, these PTFs should be there. I suggest that you check and make sure. Okay, so now we're talking about the MainView side of the configuration. So we're going to go into 4 to configure MainView products. And the first thing that we do is we go into configure our sysplexes and systems. And so here, in this particular case, you can see that I was doing sysp, which is actually in its own little monoplex, and then a couple of the LPARs on the sandbox system, the SND1plex. So here, we have gotten to the, we've gotten to panel 7 of the setup of the sysplexes, and here we are going to put in the DVC SSID. Now, what I did here is I said, okay, you know, I'm going to show you what happens when we get a older customer who has DC01 and DC02 as their SSIDs on the sandbox systems, as opposed to DC-D1 and D2, which we could manage by saying DC ampersand sysclone. Whereas on the SysP system, I just went ahead and used the normal DCSP SSID. But you do have to make sure that these are correct, because otherwise, as you get to the remote systems, you're not going to have the information there that you need. Okay, so once we're done with option 1, we'll go into option 2 and configure the MainView products. All right. So here, I am saying, yeah, I've got a very simple system. It's got MainView for ZOS, it's got the MV Alert, and it's got MainView infrastructure. That's it. Okay. So you'll notice that the only thing I have selected here to configure is MainView infrastructure. I do not need to reconfigure MainView for ZOS or MV Alert because they are already configured and nothing about this is going to change them. So in this particular case, I just select MainView infrastructure and that's all I need to do. However, if you read the little note in yellow, there are other products that use the DBC, and if those are being upgraded, then you will need to configure those as well. So for instance, if you are in an MVMQ shop and you're going from 5.2, which used to use MV Logger, and you're going to 5.3, where MainView for MQ starts using the data collector instead, then you will also have to configure that at the same time. So what you select in terms of configuration is dependent upon what products are installed and which ones are actually being upgraded. You don't need to select anything that is not being upgraded. Okay. So if I select MainView infrastructure, you can see that the beginning of it is the normal CAS and alarm manager file and XCF group, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. when you get to panel 4, this is where the new stuff for the MVI agent starts. Okay, so there in column 4, we can see the NGL PID, which by default is MVI1, and this is something that basically you should never change. There's no reason for you to change this whatsoever. It's just like the BBCS subsystem ID. It can be the same on every LPAR, and there is no conflict. There is no problem with using that. And in fact, it is highly desirable to leave this just the way it is. Same thing with retention period and the file size. If you change one, make sure that you change all of them on a given sysplex. But I think the defaults here are just fine. All right, and so here we have the storage information for the log sets. In this particular case, I said we're going to use volume logging instead of SMS logging, and here's a couple of volumes. We'll see a little bit later how this whole combination of volume and storage class plays into the logger members, and that's something of a complication that we'll see in a bit. Okay, so here then we have that sysp suffix, and note that the sysp suffix may vary for existing customers. Now, when we get into the logger section, section 3, we'll talk about how do we determine what we should be putting in there, what happens if they're different on different LPARs, and things like that. If this is a new customer that doesn't run, or even an existing customer that doesn't run MV Logger, then 00 is just fine. All right, and now here we've got the suffix for the MVI and GI member, and you'll notice that in the case of sysp, we used NI because this is a situation where we can share the member, but in the case of the sandbox, we have D1 and D2, because if you remember all the little rules about when we can share the MVI and GI member, one of the rules it was we have to be able to specify the DBC ID as something like DC ampersand sysclone. Well, if you remember, I said the DBC ID on these two LPARs was DC01 and 02, which does not match our normal DC ampersand sysclone naming standard. So therefore, they're going to need their own MVI and GI members. Now, I will just tell you that, in essence, what we're putting in here for everything except the first LPAR is simply for documentation purposes. OZCUS pays absolutely no attention to anything that you put in here except the very first LPAR that you're doing the base configuration on. And we'll see that in a little bit when we get to how this is actually deployed to the second and subsequent environments. Okay, here if you put in a register for the old MV logger, it will go into the conversion utility, and so what that will do is it will read all the existing logger files, the .a files, and it will convert them into log sets. So I don't really see a lot of value in doing this, but if your customer wants to do it, this is where they put it in, but blanks are okay, and the product will just continue on whether you put in a register name or not. Once we're done with that, you'll notice that it comes up to the normal, here's all the things that you have to do when you get done with the configuration process. We press enter, we proceed to JCL generation, because now we've got the infrastructure configured for the DBC, we've got the MainView configuration done for the MVI agent parameter members, and so we can proceed to JCL generation. And here is the list of jobs that you get. Now, notice that you get a $910 config job. This is the job that creates the staging libraries that have all the other $9 jobs in them that are normally used for MainView customization. However, the way that the MVI agent has been set up, all of the jobs that do the agent configuration are in OZCUST. Remember, I told you there's only two jobs, $445 and $465. You do not have to run the $910 config job at all because it won't generate anything for you to do to configure the agent because it has nothing to do with configuring the agent. Now, again, if you are upgrading other products and you need to run the $910 config for them, that's fine. Then run the $910 config. But you don't have to run it if all you're doing is upgrading the agent. Okay, so how does all this work, right? In the JCL library, there is a skeleton member named MVI NG something, NGI something or another, in this case NI, because we're working on SysP, and that's what I told it that our suffix was going to be. And so you can see in there that it's got all these variables in it, right, for the SysP value, the DBC ID, the NGL ID, and the space parameter. And those are in various things, right? The DBC ID and the NGL ID are in the $include INF. The DBA12 guys are in the $include MV, right? But what happens is when we run the 445 copy job, right? Well, here's the members, right? And here's the values for them. And when we run the 445 copy job, it comes and grabs the stuff out of the include members and it substitutes it into the proper variables in the skeleton member, and it writes it out to UBMC parm, right? So we've taken the JCL member, we've tailored it, now it's out there in UBMC parm. This is the operational member, right? So what has happened here? We've got SysP00, we've got the NGL ID down in 23 as MVI1 and the retention and the space and all that stuff, right? And those are basically hard-coded values. Remember, I told you that those should be the same on all the LPARs. But then in 20, right, we've got the data collector ID, and this is the data collector ID for SysP, right? But if SysP was in a sysplex with SysM and SysO and SysE, right, we wouldn't be able to use this member as is across all those LPARs, right, because the DBC ID is not DCSP on all those LPARs. So what we have to do is we have to go in here ourselves and we have to change it to DC&sysclone. All right, so in order to support a shared environment, you are going to have to make at least this much of a manual change, right, in order to get the DBC ID to be resolved correctly across multiple LPARs. Now, if you're in a monoplex and you only got one LPAR, this is fine. But if you got more than one, you're going to have to do this. Okay, any questions on that? This is our first manual intervention into the process. Okay, now, here's something to be a little concerned about. For those of you who have done this before, you know the $445 copy is run on every LPAR. And the reason it's run on every LPAR is because it creates the $DBC and $SEC parameter members for each data collector, because each data collector has a different SSID, so they each need their own $DBC and $SEC members. However, if you have made your manual change and you go back and rerun this job, guess what? You just reverted your change. So now you got it. And I did this just the other day at a customer. And I came up and I said, dang, I thought we had changed that. Yeah, we had, but it just wrote over it again when I reran this job. So your choices are wait until you're done with everything, running the however many times you run the 445 job, or make your change and take this step out of the 445 at that point and let it go and do its thing with the $DBC and SEC members. So just a little something that you may run into as you're doing this in a multi-LPAR environment. Case 2. All right, so we mentioned that. Let's go back here for a second, right? So if you're going to share this member, right, all of these parameters have to be the same or equivalent, right? So, for instance, your sysp can't be 00 for one instance, one LPAR, and 00, comma, MQ for another LPAR. There's no way of doing that unless you want to set up a special system symbol that contains that value. Same thing, NGLID. If you change that, from MVI1 on one LPAR and MVI2 on another LPAR, not going to work, right? So it's really important to keep these things in sync if you're planning on using a shared member, right? However, there are plenty of cases where you're not going to be able to use a shared member. And so that is whenever you can't meet this criteria, back on slide 9 in the first section, right? So what kind of situations, right? You've got DBC SSIDs that don't fit into the DC ampersand sysclone model. You've got multiple SysPs that are different on each LPAR. You're going to be using the UBB PARM libraries, and there's no way of specifying them in a regular manner in such as HLQ.ampersand sysname UBB PARM. In any of those cases, you're going to need multiple MVI and GI members. Okay, and as I suggest, you probably want those to end in ampersand sysclone, so at least in your 465 init, you can say ampersand sysclone for the suffix value. And that way, each data collector will point at the correct MVI and GI member without you having to go and fool around and try and make it into the correct thing. Okay, so let's talk about what happens when we take this guide that we just created, MVI, NGI, INI, over to the sandbox system. As I mentioned, the OSI does not pay any attention whatsoever to what you've put in the second and third lines here. And we'll see that when we get over to the new system. All right, so we're going to go ahead and generate our list of jobs, right? But when we take the JCL over to the second system, right, this is what this $JCL copy does. And I hope we're all familiar with this notion that as we start trying to configure a second system that is in a different sysplex, not shared BASD or whatever, right, we run this $JCL copy, we make a second copy of the library, and it's gone through and changed a bunch of internal references to the library name, et cetera, and we take this over to the new systems, in this case, the Sandbox Sysplex, SMD1 Plex, and now we're ready to start running these configuration jobs. Well, if you go in and take a look at the $include INF, guess what? Your PID and your DDC SSID are exactly what they were on the initial system, SysP, right? So you're going to have to go in here and change them, right? The only thing that it does is it sort of documents up on the top in 12 and 13 that what we think the SSID ought to be over here is DC01 on SND1 and DC02 on SND2. So you're going to have to go in and manually change this job, which is very normal when you do OSI customization, right? We're all used to doing this. Okay, so in 26, the PID can stay the same, right? We already talked about why the PID can stay the same, but the SSID is going to have to change. Okay, so now we go over to the include MV, right? And guess what? It's got the same information that it did over on SysP. Our Plex is BMC Plex 1, not SND1 Plex. Our system name is SysP, not SND1. Our sysclone isn't right. Okay, well, we don't really care about the sysplex because it's not used anywhere, but the system name and the sysclone value is used, right? So are the rest of these things. Now, one of the things to note is in 23 and 24, remember that way back in the beginning when we put in the volume or SMS information for the log sets, right, we gave them all volumes, okay? However, in 24, it's still pointing at a dev volume back on SysP. We had asked it to point at SND014 over on the sandbox. Well, I hope you remembered where you were going to put it because there is no place that you're going to find that information anywhere within OSI, right? So you're just going to have to come in here and replace it with SND014. Now, it gets better because you'll notice that next to that little thing, it says currently broken, fixed by PTF BPJ 1706 for version 3200. So right now, if you are working with a version 3100 customer and you tell it that you want to use Valseer handling for the log sets and not SMS, the logger 00 member that gets generated will not contain a Valseer parameter because it's a bug. So you'll have to go in and do that by hand, which we will see in just a minute. However, as I mentioned, in version 3200, that will be fixed, provided that you've got this particular PTF on there. So another one you should make sure you get on version 3200 if you're starting somebody out here in the next, starting now, because version 3200 is the current version. Okay, same thing with the suffix, right? It's still set to NI, but we wanted D1, right? And the logger suffix of 00 is still okay. So we have quite a bit of editing to do on this guy. Right? So we want to change that to D1. We want to change the volume to SND14. We want to change the system name. We want to change the sysclone value. So all that stuff has to be changed before we run the 445 copy, which uses all this information. So here's the 445 copy. It's going to create an MVI, NGI, whatever that suffix is, D1 in this case, and a logger 00. So here, instead of an MVI NGINI, we get an MVI NGI D1, and it's got the correct DBC ID because we changed that back in our include infrastructure. All right, so far so good. All right, continuation. Right, there are now two ways to go. Right, one of the things is you can rerun the $445 copy for each LPAR, sort of the same way that we do to create the $DBC members, right? But instead, this will be creating MVI, NGI, ampersand sysclone members. Or you can copy it and do it yourself, right? So if we want to use the native method, right? We want to use the $445. We're going to come into include infrastructure. We're going to change the SSID. We're going to come into the include MainView. We're going to change the suffix. We're going to change the system name. And we're going to change the volume, possibly, if necessary. And what else are we going to change? We're going to change something else in here. Anyway, there's 4 things that we have to change in the include MV in order to make it work. All right. Then we come out with a D2 member, and the DBC ID has changed to DCO2, and pretty much everything else is the same. Or we can do it ourselves, create a member, copy the existing member, change it to DCO2, and we're done. So whichever way you want to tell your customer to do it, the bottom line is because the DBC IDs do not fit a pattern where they can be specified using a system symbolic, every LPAR is going to have its own MVI NGI member. And you can either do it through the $445 process or you can do it through manual editing. Okay, so far? All right, so that's NVI, NGI. All right, it's not really that difficult. The main thing that we need to remember here is that if any of these parameters are not compatible across all of the LPARs within our sysplex that we're trying to configure for, because generally speaking, that UBMC PARM is a shared data set. There's only one of them, so you're not going to have separate libraries with separate parameter members in them. You're going to have one library with a parameter member for each LPAR. And if they don't fit into the naming standard that we have discussed for the shared members, then you're going to have to create one per LPAR, either through the $445 process or through hand editing. All right, so next we're going to go on to the logger members, which is where things get really complicated.